The Adventures of Tintin books are beloved by many around the world. It's very likely that you have read at least one Tintin comic, since it's a part of many people's childhood. The series is set during the 20th century. Its hero is Tintin, a young Belgian reporter and adventurer who becomes involved in dangerous cases in which he takes heroic action to save the day. He travels across the world from China in the east to America in the west. He is accompanied by his dog Snowy. Other protagonists include Captain Haddock and Professor Calculus, as well as the detectives Thompson and Thompson, and the opera diva Bianca Castafiore. The series has been admired for its clean style of drawing and Hergé's signature Ligne Claire style, which includes using clear, strong lines, all of the same width and no hatching. The style often features strong colors and a combination of cartoonish characters against a realistic background, which can give the comics a flat aspect. Known by the pen name Hergé, the Belgian cartoonist George Prosper Remy is the man behind the cult cartoon series. Hergé was born in May 22nd, 1907, in Brussels. The series' first release was in Le Petit Vingtième, The Little 20th, a youth supplement to the Belgian newspaper in 1929. Later in 1930, Hergé published the first Tintin book, titled Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. Today we know Tintin as one of the most popular cartoon characters in 20th century. By the time Hergé passed away in 1983, he had written 23 Tintin comics. Tintin has been published in more than 70 languages, with sales of more than 200 million copies. Numerous film adaptations have been made from the series, and we can still expect more in upcoming years. The series has also been adapted for radio, television, and theater. Tintin in the Congo is the sequel to Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, so it's the second book in the series. It follows Tintin and Snowy, who are sent to the Belgian Congo to report on events in the country. They explore the country, meet people who welcome them and cheer them, and experience the adventures that happen to them in Congo. Tintin ends up preventing a criminal diamond smuggling operation run by the American gangster Al Capone. The book has come under criticism for its racist portrayal of the Congolese people and the glorification of the European colonization. The Congolese people are portrayed as infantile and stupid, and are drawn in very racist way resembling blackface. The comic has also been criticized for its portrayal of big game hunting and the mass slaughter of African wildlife. It showed graphic images of animals being cut up alive, blown up with dynamite, worn as a costume, and being slaughtered. Hergé has later stated that he was not happy with the work. Despite the controversy, it was quite popular and was followed a year later by Tintin in America.
Tintin originally began as an issue in the Belgian magazine known as The 20th Century, written by Georges Prosper Remy under the pen name Hergé. As a kid-friendly introduction to various cultures through the lens of the far-right, Catholic, and proto-fascist view of the magazine. Tintin, who was inspired by Hergé's previous work on the adventures of Todor, scout leader of the cockchafers, was a reporter who could see past the facades of socialism and was therefore relentlessly hunted by the Soviets. The publishing of Tintin's debut volume in 1929 preceded the golden age of comics by almost a decade, but it was incredibly influential and remained so, despite the fringe political origins of its publication. The core ideas of anti-socialism and anti-Semitism that characterized the magazine are present in the volume, but subtextual enough to go unnoticed by most readers. But it's most obvious in the caricature of different Soviet agents, in which they have large lips, they were supposed to be a caricature of Jews. The series continued like this for some years and notably exhibited strong colonial sentiment towards Congo in the volume Tintin in the Land of Congo, but along with some very, very racist portrayals of black people. However, the series transformed somewhat in the 40s during World War II, when his publisher, Hergé's publisher in Belgium, was shut down by the occupying Reich. And due to political reasons, so Hergé was forced to continue the series at a new publisher, the newspaper known as Le Soir, but sans any political themes to avoid friction with the government. So for this reason, Tintin was no longer a reporter and was now an explorer. After the Allies invaded Belgium, the series had to go on hold until he was offered a publishing deal with Le Lombard in 1946, which allowed for the creation of Tintin magazine, whose staff eventually reorganized to form the independent studios Hergé, which would publish new issues of the Adventures of Tintin until Hergé's death in 1983. Along with several film adaptations in form of cartoons. The various adaptations in the storytelling over the years included the introduction of color, innovations in artwork and paneling, as well as the overall change in political landscapes. Tintin was remarkably versatile in that way, seeing as he is an observer who rarely makes statements about what he sees, but rather passively observes and simply reacts to the world he's presented, however offensive that portrayal may be. So, despite the questionable origins of the series, Tintin is a great example of an artist's vision outgrowing and escaping the legitimately disgusting politics that once defined him. I read the Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, which was the debut volume, which was published in the 20th century from 1929 to 1930 as an introduction for kids to the far-right fringe politics of the magazine. And in general, I'd say that it's not very remarkable, despite for a Tintin volume at least. I think the artistry was not very sophisticated yet, and the paneling was incredibly rudimentary. It felt the panels were all pretty much 2x3s or 3x1s, so really never saw any sophisticated or non-square shaped panels. But however, it does remain unique and for a Tintin book because of its black and white nature, which was I believe it's the only Tintin novel which is completely without color. But also because it kind of introduced Tintin in very, very quickly as a character who is somewhat passive, but is always somewhat threatening to cultures like the Soviets, which, of course, there were many lies going on in the Soviet Union, which are somewhat exaggerated in this book, like the fact that they would export tremendous quantities of food to different countries to try and fake or create a facade of wealth and opulence within the Soviet Union, which wasn't really the case, as a lot of people were starving in the Soviet Union, and it was a tremendously unjust place to live for a very long time.
Tintin and paneling. Tintin is a comic and therefore has paneling. And although it is pretty basic and ordinary, it is still pretty solid. First off, let me explain why it's pretty basic. Most Tintin books are just a bunch of panels lined together that almost all contain either Tintin himself talking, or in the background, or his pet dog Snowy. Pretty basic, right? But well, it works. But let's go into it a bit further. The paneling in Tintin, though has remained similar over the years, has had a subtle change. Here's an example. In the first Tintin book, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, the paneling is the same as I mentioned earlier, but simpler. Fewer but bigger, more focused images. Now let's look at this page from Destination Moon, which was written 3 decades later. And the first thing that you notice is that each page is a lot more panel and information heavy. This is probably due to the change in timelines here. The first Tintin book being published in the 20s and Destination Moon in the 50s, better known in the comic industry as the Silver Age. Anyway, enough of this. Let's talk about the good stuff. The great paneling in Tintin. Well, at least in Destination Moon. If you haven't noticed yet, that is the Tintin book that I reread for this video essay / presentation since I own it and love it. Most of the paneling here is pretty basic, but when I turn the page, bam! This is a beautiful splash. Also, let's look at page number 60 of the same novel. And here we get great paneling. We see the rocket starting to lifting off, and next to it, each character's reaction to it. Tintin feeling ill, Captain Haddock feeling even worse. Snowy doesn't know what is going on. The scientist that went with them is also a bit stressed. And Professor Calculus is just sleeping. Which I thought was a bit funny. Not necessarily because it is a well-written joke, but because the scene, through paneling and the constant countdown to liftoff, the tension the characters feel because they do not know whether they will make it or not, you follow the scene in that order. And when you're expecting Professor Calculus to also be unwell, he's just sound asleep. It is a play on expectations, and the page is designed so that you read it in the right order that makes the joke work. This is the importance of good paneling. Paneling is meant to create flow, a flow of what feels almost like moving images. Bad paneling takes you all over the place, reading things in the wrong order, and looking too boring or too overwhelming. Boring would be when you just don't try at all, and overwhelming paneling would be when you are trying, perhaps a bit too much, and end up failing astonishingly. This would usually lead to the reader getting a headache. You do not want that. Good paneling is when it's not just a bunch of same-size panels with speech bubbles in them again and again. That would be boring and repetitive. It is when the artist has captured flow and everything is read in the right order. In this regard, Tintin has kept the quality and even improved over the years.
The Seven Crystal Balls is the 13th installment of Hergé's Tintin. It is a two-parter and we will focus on the first part today. We first learn about the Sanders Hardiman expedition, which was an archaeological expedition to the Andes Mountains. The members brought home the mummified body of Inca king Raskar Kapak, among other things. Members of the Sanders Hardiman expedition have been falling into comas with fragments of shattered crystal balls by their side. Tintin, Haddock, and Professor Calculus visit one of the expedition members yet to be affected. He was an old classmate of Professor Calculus, and his name is Professor Hercules Tarragon. The body of Raskar Kapak is kept in his house, and he shows it to our protagonists. In the evening, a lightning storm hits the house, and Raskar Kapak is struck by lightning, which evaporates his body. Our protagonists are awoken that night, all with the same dream of Capac's mummy throwing a crystal ball on their floor. They find Professor Tarragon in a coma with crystal shards by his bed. Calculus then finds Capac's bracelet on the floor and puts it on. Later, he goes missing, and Tintin and Haddock discover Calculus' hat on a dock and conclude that he is on a ship headed for Peru. The story continues in the next installment. An interesting thing to note from the story is Haddock's transformation. He transformed from this miserable alcoholic into this rich, fine gentleman. Even though I miss the old Haddock and I don't think his transformation was the most believable thing in the world, it's cool to see some character development and really feel like you know this world and getting to know the characters better. Another interesting thing to note is Snowy. Snowy is obviously Tintin's dog, and in the previous stories he always had some fun one-liners to bring into the conversation. And he was always saying something, he was always complaining about this or that, but in this story he was just a normal dog, which is kind of sad. Another interesting thing to note about this story is the scary elements. Tintin is not often characterized by the word scary, but the story really had some horror elements woven into it. If we think about it, the main thing the story is trying to do is make us afraid of the unknown, and that is reflected in the characters and the imagery of the comic. This is truly the most scary Tintin comic, and even though this statement doesn't hold a lot of weight, I really do think it's something that makes this story unique. The style that Hergé goes for in Tintin is very straightforward. The style is called ligne clair and is characterized by clear, strong lines, often all of the same width, and very strong, pronounced colors. There is very little shading used, also contributing to the crystal clear feel of the comic. I would compare the style to a children's coloring book. He often combines cartoon characters with realistic backgrounds. Even though his style oftentimes feels quite simplistic and it is so familiar to us, there is nothing that really brings the same energy and atmosphere that the Tintin comics bring, even though the style has influenced many other comics since. In my opinion, the style that Hergé draws in is the major reason why Tintin comics feel so nostalgic. The line's uniformity oftentimes made me feel like there had to be some sacrifice of detail, but that is far from the truth. The panels are often crowded with so many items, characters, detailed buildings, machines, treasures, and landscapes. The lack of shading and the clear lines bring all of those aspects to the forefront, and it does so much to bring the reader into the comic and to really feel like he is a part of this world. Here we can see a panel of the rocket that went to the moon. The first thing to note is the colors, the red and white rocket that is so familiar to us, the clean yellow crane things we all know too well, the bright blue sky and the beautiful mountains in the background. The second thing to note is the uniform lines. Almost every line is the same width, adding to the clear feeling of the panel. The third is the amount of things going on in this panel and the detail they are displayed in. There is so much detail, and the lack of shadows and the clear lines bring all of that detail so close to us. We can really feel the busy atmosphere that Hergé is trying to convey to us. And that will conclude my analyzation of the art style used in the Tintin comics.
And the entire presentation. Goodbye.